speakers time to respond to Kanji's questions, but also please do think about them and fire off your questions anytime, but especially at the Q&A session at the end. Now I'd like to invite the second of our distinguished mature generation to come and speak. This is actually my boss, so I've got to be a little careful here and read directly from the script. Yeah.
We never knew.
Andrea, we wouldn't have known Mohammed, but peel back a little bit. She's sitting behind me. Andrea Ho has worked in broadcast media for more than 20 years, including 7 years here in Canberra, where she's the station manager of my workplace, 666 ABC Canberra. Andrea is Australian of immigrant parents and had a typical Aussie immigrant upbringing, whatever that means, in the suburbs of Melbourne. She's also recently, she didn't put this in her introduction, but I'm going to put it in there for her. She's recently the recipient of a Churchill Fellowship. She's off soon to the UK and Sweden to study diversity in media and how we can all represent the world together. Without adding further compliments, Andrea Ho.
Taller than what I think sometimes. I have to move that microphone a lot. Hello. I'm really glad to have heard the other three speakers and to have come last, because they've said a number of the points that I was thinking about in my mind, which is definitely going to keep you to 5 minutes. I think it's a bonus. Of course, standing here, I have to tell you a little bit about myself, but before I do that, I'd like to find out a little bit about you, if you don't mind. I'm going to ask people to raise some hands. Can you tell me, raise your hand if you would, how many of you came to Australia as adults? Well, how did you feel like you were an adult, or did you feel like you were a child? I think that's correct. So that's a lot of adults, about half the room. How many of you were either born in Australia of a different cultural background, or came to Australia when you were a child from a different cultural background? Okay, that's a good proportion too. And how many of you are Australian of multiple generations? Actually, that's a nice sort of mix, really. It's about a third of each. That's good. We understand that there's a mix in the group. I think Mohammed put me here because although I am a person of immigrant parents but born in Australia, I've had the opportunity to have grown up in Australia a bit earlier than two of our previous speakers, and so perhaps the difference for me is that I've had a bit more time to reflect and to have some of these conversations about identity and about culture with my parents as an adult as opposed to as a child. I think that growing up as a child in a culture like Australia, from a different cultural background, means that you do end up carrying a couple of different identities around with you. And in my particular case, I was very impressed, by the way, something about your background. I also have three. And I think I actually fall into around about 1 in 5 million or so too. I did the census figures. My father is Chinese, my mother is Dutch, and there aren't too many of those around. Well, I do have a sister, so there's at least 2 of us. And so there's only about 1 in 5 million of me in Australia as well. And by the way, while we're on those cultural similes, I like the coconut, hadn't heard that before. In my circle, we talk about bananas. Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. People like my husband, we talk about those as eggs. White on the outside, a little bit yellow on the inside. There you go. There's all kinds of cultural similes that you can bring to this. The whole point, I suppose, is to say, are we, the children of mixed generations, destined to be mixed up? Or can we actually mix in? And I think that that's the question that each of us has to ask ourselves, really. Part of that, I think, depends on who we are inside. Part of that depends on the people who help us to grow. And partly, as well, the community in which we are growing up. So the kinds of conversations that I had with my parents in my teens and my early 20s were exactly what you might expect. They were as fraught and as difficult as any of those intergenerational conversations are, but they were perhaps made even more difficult by some of those cross-cultural aspects. And to tell you a little bit about myself and my family, everybody needs a bit of context, don't they? Both of my parents grew up in theatres of war, or were born into, or just after theatres of war. My mother in Europe, in Holland, my father in Singapore. And he was born, in fact, under Japanese occupation in those difficult times. So they came to Australia really to find a new life. My mother came with her family, and she came with no English. They didn't speak any English, and went to country towns, various country towns where nobody spoke Dutch, and so it was a very difficult arrival in Australia for that family. They came and had to start again, the way many migrants do. My father came to Australia as a teenager. He came to study, and he had English when he came, but he also had a Chinese face at the time. The tail end of the White Australia policy was still being unwound in Australia, and those were interesting times as well. They met at university, and they broke all their cultural barriers in order to get married. My mother used to like to describe it at home when we were having a bit of a laugh. She'd say, you know, she'd say, I took your father home to my little country town, and not only was he not even Catholic, he wasn't even Christian. So that was, you know, a big source of shame and horror. It was obviously difficult for Dad to be accepted into Mum's family. More difficult for Mum to be accepted into Dad's family. For goodness sake, the oldest son in a Chinese family marrying a white woman and saying he wasn't going to go home to head the family. His older sister was sent out to stop him from getting married. That didn't happen, here I am. So they had already done a fair bit of dealing with intercultural issues. It was then, I think, perhaps a bit of a surprise for me to have to deal with my parents' cultural issues in order for me to grow up. And I think that perhaps the reflection on that as we got older was every one of us turns into our parents, don't we? And you hear those things coming out of your mouths and you think to yourself, I swore when I had kids I was never going to say that. Where did that come from? And I think that that's a natural human thing that occurs across cultures and across generations. But boy, some of the cultural echoes that you might have with different cultures are pretty ugly. So there was Dad, you know, he'd defied all his parents' wishes, and he'd done what he wanted to do, came to Australia. He did some of the things he was supposed to do. He studied engineering, like a good Chinese boy. And he, I think, thought that he was going to have a very different life for his children. So why on earth did we argue when I was growing up about what I was going to study, about whether or not I'd be allowed to have a boyfriend, and so on and so on, the kinds of things you can imagine. That was a very difficult thing for me to overcome. In the case of my mother, there were a lot of arguments with Dad about how we were going to be brought up. They decided to not bring us up in a particular religion because they were both from quite different religious backgrounds, but we were to be brought up with a knowledge of our cultural religious backgrounds. So there were clashes when I spent a little bit more time at church because my grandparents on my mother's side were here. My grandmother was very devoutly Catholic, and there was very little interaction with religion on my father's side of the family. We had to work through some of those issues too. So there are aspects, I think, on reflection that drive children mad growing up in mixed cultures that we would love to be able to say to our parents as our parents are guiding us into adulthood. I don't want to speak for both of you, but there is an aspect perhaps you can respond and say maybe it was like that for you or maybe it wasn't. So some of the things that I wish I had been able to say to my parents as a teenager, which I did get to say as an adult, we had some interesting conversations around them. Maybe some of these will resonate for you as well. What I wanted to say to Mum and Dad was, I'm growing up here in Australia. I'm not growing up in Holland. I'm not growing up in Singapore. You have to allow me to balance all of the cultures in our family, okay? I would rather be mixed in than mixed up. Please don't pull me in many different directions. It's a fine line that I knew that my parents have to tread in teaching me the best of their cultures, but not making me a prisoner of those cultures, because eventually you become a prisoner of time as well, as Kanti was describing. Things move on in other countries, but your memory doesn't move on if you come to Australia with the memory fixed in your mind. So I would say, you chose to come to Australia and you're proud of being Australian. Let me be the Australian that you wanted me to be. Don't try and make me into a person from your culture. And that's something that we have to work through. An example that I learned about was, we talked about language and about how many different languages you speak. I had the misfortune now, it was good fortune in the 70s growing up in a household where my parents were very literate in English. But it meant that I didn't learn another language because sadly Mum didn't speak Chinese and Dad didn't speak Dutch, so we all spoke English at home. But I remember speaking to a Member of Parliament in New South Wales who described how he grew up in a Turkish family and his parents were not confident with English. They ran a restaurant And he consequently grew up with Turkish because they wanted him to be fluent in Turkish. So they tried really hard to make sure that his Turkish was good. And when he went to school on his first day, he didn't have any English, and he didn't know how to ask to go to the toilet, and so he wet his pants. And it was a shame that he carried with him to adulthood. And I felt so terribly sorry for him, because in being drawn towards one to the exclusion of the other culture, he carries a scar from that. And so trying to balance those things, I think, is really important. Now, if you've come to Australia and you are a proud Australian, and I think that's pretty normal, then remember that your children are going to be Australians as well, and that means the bad bits as well as the good bits. This is where they live now. This is where I live now. And so they're not going to be the same as the children from the culture that you came from. And Jimmy worked through that one at quite some length. An example might be around trying to get your kids to do the things that you wanted to do. Dad wanted me to do martial arts. There was nothing I wanted to do less, truly. And we had a few fights about that. Some of them quite literally would say, look, let me show you how I could break your arm. If only I just pulled a little harder. I'd say, Dad, just stop it, you know, enough. Instead, we made a compromise on something that he loved as a boy. He was a big fan of Boy Scouts, and he had had a terrific time growing up as a Boy Scout in Singapore. Stories of what he used to get up to were nothing like what I got up to, but he made me go and join Girl Guides. That worked out really well for me. But I did it in an Australian context, and that came out very well. What I wanted to say to my mum and dad was, don't judge your mixed-in children by standards that don't apply here. Because if you came to Australia for a greater freedom of choice, then that's actually what we're going to exercise. So yes, we had the inevitable argument about education. I'm the only child in my family who had an arts education, to the undying shame of my father's family in particular. Never mind that I've made a living in the media for 20 odd years, never mind a number of other achievements along the way. Up until about 2 years ago, every time I'd go home to Melbourne and see Dad, Dad would say, eventually, so you're still happy doing what you're doing? You know, I could find you another job. You could do something different. I eventually actually had to sit down as an adult in my 40s and say, Dad, it's okay. This works fine for me. I had to understand that this came from his concern and his love for me. It took me some getting used to as well. So as children, we have to accept that we don't know the pain of bringing us up. We can't imagine the pain that we inflict on our parents anyway. Probably none of us can. But questions like that are a little bit of an insight. We have to understand that our parents can't necessarily ever see or hear the way that we react to the same things that they experience. So an example for that of me is when you have an experience of a racist comment. Now, I think you talk to migrants, and I would talk to my parents, I'd say, look, it just happens. You just have to learn to put up with that. But their feelings around that, I think, were different because they did come from another country to Australia. My feelings around it are outrageous because I was born here. How dare you say that about me? So we had to deal with a completely different set of feelings. I didn't understand Mum and Dad's because I couldn't understand how they would just put up with it. They couldn't understand why I was so outraged. These were things that we had to balance up. So when we talk about cross-culture and being mixed up, that can happen in any family. We have a few more bridges that we have to build in our cross-cultural families, and we have a bigger obligation, I think, to do so, because when things fracture in our families, they get particularly difficult. We don't necessarily have the support of extended family or the understanding of our broader community of the issues that we face, so we have to work harder at it. But I would say that it's worth it in order to be mixed in. Thanks.
Andrea Ho, thank you, Andrea. For me, I got out of that especially how sort of frank and open Andrea's conversations were with her parents when she was growing up. As someone that works with Andrea, I know very well that she is a very frank and open person. She's always telling me where I've stepped over the line making a bad joke on air or doing something I shouldn't. But I wonder, very rarely, in all seriousness, how those sorts of questions and those sort of statements that Andrea made with her parents, don't judge me by the old standards, let me be the Australian that I want to be, that you should want me to be, whether those rang through to people here as something that was a bit too far or unlikely to happen in your family situation, or whether you thought, yeah, that is the kind of conversation that we have, that's something that we are capable of having. Because I think that's probably something that varies from family to family. Anyway, just something that I've been thinking about. We'll have a break.